June 25th, 1876. The sun had been up for hours when over 600 U.S. Army soldiers rode in columns toward the valley of the Little Bighorn River in what is now southern Montana. By the following morning, more than 260 of them were dead, including their commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer. Every man under his direct command had been killed, not one survived. The news reached the rest of the country on July 4th. The same day, Americans were celebrating their nation's centennial, holding parades and giving speeches about progress and manifest destiny and the irresistible march of civilization westward. It landed with the force of something that had no clean explanation. The year 1876 was also a presidential election year, Rutherford Hayes against Samuel Tilden, and both parties had reasons to manage what the defeat at Little Bighorn meant for national morale. The Grant administration had been plagued by scandal. The economy had not recovered from the panic of 1873. The country needed its military to represent something reliable and righteous. A disaster on the frontier produced by an officer's vanity was not a useful story, so the story was changed. But what most people were told about Little Bighorn, both then and for generations afterward, was a carefully arranged distortion. The full truth was darker, more complicated, and far more disturbing than the legend that replaced it. George Armstrong Custer was not the man the newspapers made him. He was not the gallant hero of the plains, not the bold cavalryman whose instincts were simply overwhelmed by impossible odds. He was a vain, politically ambitious officer whose career had been built as much on self-promotion as on genuine military accomplishment. During the Civil War, he had risen with unusual speed, partly because of battlefield recklessness that some superiors mistook for bravery, and partly because he understood instinctively the power of the press. He cultivated journalists. He wrote dispatches that glorified his own actions. He wore a customized uniform with a red neckerchief and let his golden hair grow long, constructing a personal mythology with the same deliberateness a modern public relations firm would recognize and respect. After the Civil War, Custer was sent west. The frontier was supposed to be a second act, another stage for his particular brand of performance. He led the 7th Cavalry in campaigns against the Cheyenne and Lakota Sioux, and the results were mixed at best. At the Washita River in 1868, he attacked a peaceful Cheyenne village led by Black Kettle, a man who had survived the Sand Creek Massacre 4 years earlier and had made every effort to maintain peace with the United States government in the years between. Custer killed men, women, and children, destroyed the community's winter food supply, then abandoned a number of his own soldiers who had ridden ahead and been cut off, leaving them without retrieval. He called it a victory. The Army largely agreed. The military's definition of success on the plains had little to do with ethics. By 1876, the United States government had a serious problem of its own making. The 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty had designated the Black Hills of South Dakota as unceded Lakota territory, land formally recognized as belonging to the Sioux Nation under federal law. 3 years after that treaty was signed, Custer led an expedition into those same hills and reported back what prospectors had long suspected: gold. His announcement set off a rush that the government made only token efforts to stop. Miners flooded into Lakota land. The Sioux resisted. The government, unwilling to enforce its own treaty and unwilling to compensate the Lakota fairly for land it now wanted, issued an ultimatum in December 1875. All non-reservation Lakota and Cheyenne were ordered to report to their designated reservations by January 31st, 1876, in the middle of winter, across hundreds of miles of open country. The deadline was physically impossible for many bands to meet, and the men who set it knew that. It was a pretext for military action, not a genuine attempt at resolution. What the Army encountered at Little Bighorn was the accumulated consequence of years of broken promises. Thousands of Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho had gathered in the valley. Estimates placed the total population between 10 and 15,000 people, with warriors numbering somewhere between 2 and 4,000. They had come together not to prepare for war in the abstract, but because reservation conditions were desperate, promised rations were routinely rotten or simply never delivered, and land that had been guaranteed was being seized piece by piece. The village on the Little Bighorn stretched for miles along the river. Weeks before the battle, Sitting Bull, the Hunkpapa Lakota spiritual leader, had conducted a sun dance ceremony in which he sacrificed 100 pieces of flesh cut from his arms and reported a vision afterward. Soldiers falling into the Lakota camp upside down, like grasshoppers dropping from the sky, their hats tumbling from their heads as they fell. He told his people the vision meant that a great number of soldiers were coming and that many would die. His people received this not as metaphor, but as clear instruction about what to prepare for. General Alfred Terry had organized the summer campaign against this coalition of tribes. The plan called for 3 separate columns to converge on the suspected location of the large village. Terry from the north, General George Crook from the south, Colonel John Gibbon from the west. Custer and the 7th Cavalry functioned as the mobile strike force within Terry's column. The strategy depended entirely on coordination. What Terry did not know when he sent Custer south along the Rosebud was that Crook's column had already been stopped cold. Just 8 days before Little Bighorn, at a creek called the Rosebud, Crazy Horse led several hundred warriors in an attack on Crook's force that lasted most of a day and forced the general to withdraw southward. The southern column that was supposed to close the trap around the Little Bighorn village was no longer in any position to do so. Custer rode toward that village without knowing the trap he had been part of had already sprung on someone else. On June 22nd, Custer took the 7th Cavalry south. Terry's instructions were explicit. Do not attack before the other columns were in position. Scout the area, confirm the village's location, and wait for the coordinated movement. Custer had no intention of waiting. He had political motivations layered beneath the military ones. He was in the middle of a very public feud with President Ulysses Grant, had been temporarily stripped of command earlier that year after testifying before Congress about corruption in the Indian Bureau, corruption that reached into Grant's own family. Little Bighorn was Custer's opportunity to rehabilitate his public standing, to become indispensable again, to ride back into national favor carrying a great triumph in his hands. A coordinated victory shared with Terry and Gibbon offered him nothing he needed. A solo victory offered him everything. His scouts warned him. His Crow scouts, men who knew this terrain intimately and who understood warfare in this country far better than any officer from the East, told him the village was enormous, larger than anything they had encountered. One scout, a man named Half Yellow Face, reportedly told Custer directly that he did not expect to survive what lay ahead. Custer dismissed these warnings the way he had dismissed similar counsel his entire career. At the Washita, he had divided his command and attacked an unreconnoitered target, and the Army had called it inspired. He saw no reason to recalibrate. On the morning of June 25th, when his scouts spotted the village from an elevated position called the Crow's Nest, Custer made the decision that sealed his command's fate. Believing, on thin evidence, that the village had already detected his approach, he launched his assault immediately, rather than resting his exhausted men and horses and waiting for coordinated support. He divided his regiment into 3 battalions. Captain Frederick Benteen was sent left to prevent any escape in that direction. Major Marcus Reno was ordered to cross the Little Bighorn River and strike the southern end of the village. Custer took 5 companies, approximately 210 men, north along the bluffs above the river, intending to attack from the opposite end of the camp and catch the village in a pincer. It could not escape. What happened to Reno's battalion in the opening minutes of his charge illustrated exactly how badly Custer had misread the situation. Reno's men rode toward the southern end of the village, expecting a panic in camp. They found instead a mass of mounted Lakota and Cheyenne warriors moving toward them with a speed and organization that made an offensive push impossible. Reno halted, attempted to hold a skirmish line in the timber along the river, then ordered a withdrawal that became a rout. Men were shot in the water crossing back. Others scattered into the bluffs above. Reno survived, but barely, and his command was badly bloodied within minutes of first contact. Benteen, having found nothing in the direction Custer had sent him, was riding to rejoin the regiment when a trumpeter arrived carrying Custer's final written order, a note that read, in part, "Come on, big village, be quick, bring packs. Benteen merged his force with Reno's survivors on the bluffs south of the main battlefield. Together, they dug in and repelled repeated attacks through the remainder of the 25th and most of the 26th, running low on ammunition, unable to provide adequate care for their wounded. Men used whatever came to hand to dig shallow rifle pits, knives, tin cups, bare hands, while sharpshooters worked from the surrounding ridges. From their position, they could hear, somewhere to the north, the sounds of fighting where Custer had gone. Then the sound stopped entirely. For hours, no one in Reno's position knew with certainty what had happened. The silence told them enough. What happened on the ridge now called Last Stand Hill remains a matter of reconstruction from physical evidence, oral testimony, and forensic archaeology. The broad outline is not in dispute. Custer led his 5 companies north with the intention of crossing the river and striking the village at its far end. He never reached the crossing. Warriors under the direction of Crazy Horse moved to cut him off, swinging around to attack from the north while others pressed from the riverside, creating an encirclement before the cavalry column could establish any defensible ground. The terrain worked against the soldiers as much as the warriors worked against them. The ridgeline offered no natural cover, no water, no shelter. Men who had been in the saddle for 2 days on inadequate sleep and rations were fighting dismounted on exposed ground against opponents who had every geographic advantage. Lakota and Cheyenne survivors described the fighting coming from multiple directions at once, the soldiers' horses panicking under fire, men and animals separating from one another in ways that destroyed unit cohesion faster than any direct assault could have. The engagement may have lasted an hour. Some accounts suggest it was over in 20 minutes or less. By any measure, it was comprehensive. When it ended, not one of Custer's 210 men remained alive. Custer himself was found with 2 bullet wounds, one through the chest and one through the left temple. Whether the head wound was the killing shot or was inflicted after death has never been definitively established. Whether Custer died from enemy fire or from a shot fired by one of his own men who refused to be taken alive is a question the Army chose never to pursue officially. Both possibilities circulated in the weeks following the battle and were then allowed to sink without formal examination. The bodies were mutilated. This is the part of the story that most accounts acknowledge briefly before moving on, treating it as a grim postscript rather than a meaningful historical event. But what happened to the dead at Little Bighorn was not random violence. It was purposeful, shaped by specific cultural and spiritual frameworks held by the people who had fought there. And it deserves the same serious historical attention as any other part of the battle. Among many Plains tribes, the body of an enemy killed in battle was a legitimate site of expression with specific ritual meaning. Counting coup, touching a living enemy or a freshly killed one, was among the highest martial honors a warrior could claim. Mutilation carried more varied meanings depending on context and intention. Some acts were meant to dishonor an enemy and diminish his standing. Others connected to beliefs about the afterlife, that a body altered in particular ways would enter the next world diminished, stripped of the ability to fight or threaten. Women of the tribes participated as well, and the severity of what was done was sometimes proportional to specific knowledge about who the dead man was and what he had done in life. Soldiers recognized from previous raids on peaceful camps, men known to have killed women and children, were treated with a particular thoroughness that reflected the specificity of what they had done. Custer's own body was left comparatively intact. He had been stripped and there were wounds consistent with post-mortem mutilation, but the worst of what was done to others was spared him. Some accounts suggest he was not recognized. Others describe a deliberate choice made by those who stood over him. Whatever the reason, his men were in far worse condition. Limbs had been severed, men had been disemboweled, skulls were crushed. The soldiers who arrived 2 days later under Terry's command encountered a scene that several officers described in ways suggesting permanent psychological damage. One wrote in his private journal that he wished he had never come to this country at all. The Lakota and Cheyenne who had fought that day had reasons specific to them and to this particular moment. The men they were killing had come to enforce the destruction of their world. The government that sent those soldiers had broken every significant agreement it had made. The land they were defending was land their grandparents had hunted, land where generations of their people had been buried, land promised in binding federal documents and then taken anyway. What was done to the bodies on Last Stand Hill was not an expression of savagery without context. It was an expression of accumulated grief, of fury shaped by a generation of dispossession, processed through cultural practices as coherent and purposeful as any human system of meaning, even if those practices were entirely unfamiliar to the men who later tried to describe them. The military response that followed was immediate and relentless. The Army intensified its campaign against the Lakota and Cheyenne throughout the winter of 1876 and into 1877, pursuing scattered bands with a persistence that left almost no room for survival outside of surrender. Crazy Horse gave himself up in May 1877 and was killed that September in a murky confrontation at Fort Robinson in Nebraska, the precise details of which remain disputed to this day. Sutton Bull fled north into Canada with part of his following, returned in 1881 after years of exile, and spent the remainder of his life as a prisoner and then a reservation resident before being shot and killed during an arrest attempt by Indian police in December 1890. The Black Hills were never returned. In 1980, the Supreme Court ruled that the United States had taken the land illegally and ordered financial compensation, a sum that had grown with interest to more than $1 billion by the 2000s. The Lakota Nation refused the money. They wanted the land itself, and the land had not been offered. The myth of Little Bighorn was assembled with extraordinary speed. Within days of the news reaching eastern cities, newspapers were framing the battle as a massacre of brave soldiers by savage enemies rather than as a military defeat produced by a commander's catastrophic misjudgment. Custer became a martyr. Artists painted him standing defiantly on the hilltop, sword raised, a weapon he had not actually carried that day, surrounded by fallen warriors, dying with theatrical nobility rather than in the confusion and terror of a collapse he had engineered himself. Dime novelists turned his story into serial fiction within months. His wife Elizabeth spent the next 57 years aggressively cultivating this legend, writing memoirs, delivering lectures, and guarding her husband's image with a ferocity that kept the martyrdom narrative alive and kept critics at a distance long after anyone who might have effectively challenged her was gone. The country needed a hero more than it needed the truth, and she understood that calculation better than anyone. The Army's formal investigation, conducted in 1879, focused almost entirely on whether Reno and Benteen had failed in their duty to reach Custer more quickly. Both men were cleared. The court of inquiry was designed structurally to avoid the obvious central question: that Custer had disobeyed explicit orders, divided his force before an enemy of unknown size, acted on political ambition rather than military judgment, and caused the deaths of more than 200 men as a consequence of those choices. The Army had built a hero around this man. Establishing that the hero's own arrogance had killed his command was not a conclusion the institution was prepared to reach publicly or officially. Physical evidence has done more to recover the actual battle than any official process. A grass fire in 1983 swept the battlefield and cleared sufficient ground for archaeologists to map the distribution of cartridge cases, bullets, and human remains across the terrain. They found that Springfield carbines used by the soldiers had a documented tendency to jam in rapid fire. The brass casings would swell with heat and stick in the chamber, forcing soldiers to extract them by hand in the middle of combat. Spent casings showing marks of improvised extraction were found across the battlefield. Men had died trying to clear their weapons. What they found contradicted the organized last stand of legend in nearly every detail. Rather than a disciplined defensive formation holding the high ground, the evidence showed fragmentation, small clusters of men scattered across a wide area, horses and riders separated, positions suggesting movement and retreat rather than consolidation under fire. The forensic picture was of a command that fractured under pressure and died not in a heroic defensive action, but in a disintegration that happened to leave no witnesses on the losing side. Lakota and Cheyenne oral traditions recorded in the years immediately after the battle and carried forward through subsequent generations have only recently received the serious historical engagement they warranted from the beginning. For decades, the practice in mainstream academic history was to treat native testimony as supplemental color rather than primary evidence, useful for atmosphere, unreliable for fact. That hierarchy has been largely overturned. Men like Two Moons, a Cheyenne leader who fought at Little Bighorn, and Kill Eagle, a Blackfoot Sioux chief, gave accounts describing coordinated warriors moving with deliberate, tactical purpose rather than a mass driven by momentum or emotion. Crazy Horse appeared in multiple accounts as composed under fire, directing movement, thinking through the engagement systematically rather than simply pressing forward on instinct. He was 35 years old at Little Bighorn, already a veteran of a decade of warfare, and it showed. These were fighters who had spent years in defensive conflict against a technologically superior force and had developed substantial tactical intelligence as a result. They were not an overwhelming mob that crushed a small detachment through sheer numerical weight. They were experienced combatants on ground they knew, fighting with awareness and purpose. The question of how many native fighters died at Little Bighorn is contested, and the contestation is itself revealing. The Army and the public that absorbed its version of events needed the enemy force to be enormous to explain away the scale of the defeat. The more warriors there were, the more the loss became a function of impossible odds rather than failed leadership. Native accounts, which carried no particular incentive to minimize their own casualties, typically describe between 30 and 100 warriors killed with additional wounded. The contrast between those figures and the 268 soldiers killed speaks plainly. This was a decisive military defeat executed with efficiency that the mythology of the battle has spent a century obscuring. What took place at Little Bighorn in June 1876 was not a tragedy in the sense of something that could not have been prevented. It was the product of traceable decisions made by identifiable people operating within a moral and political framework that was visibly corrupt at the time. A government that broke its own treaty to serve mining interests. An army that treated the enforcement of legal obligations as optional when those obligations were inconvenient. An officer who spent his men's lives purchasing a moment of personal glory. A country that absorbed the cost of all these failures and transformed them into legend because legend asked nothing of anyone and accountability demanded everything. The warriors who stood on those bluffs on the afternoon of June 25, 1876, understood what they had won. Most of them also understood it would not be enough. The great encampment dispersed within days of the battle because its leaders recognized that remaining concentrated gave the pursuing army exactly the kind of target it needed. They scattered across the plains and the army hunted them through the winter. And within a year, most of the people who had fought at Little Bighorn were dead, imprisoned, or confined to reservations. The victory did not save the Lakota and Cheyenne way of life. It drew down a military response that arrived with the full weight of a humiliated nation behind it and finished the destruction faster than anything else could have. The most disturbing truth about Little Bighorn is not the mutilated bodies or the reckless general or the defeat of a regiment sent somewhere it had no business going. The most disturbing truth is that the entire event was the foreseeable consequence of a national policy grounded in dishonesty and dispossession, and that when that policy extracted its cost from the people sent to enforce it, the country chose to honor their deaths rather than examine what they had been ordered to die for.